Welcome to Chapter 3, Agriculture and Foodways. So we'll spend a couple moments just talking about agriculture. It's an incredibly important piece of our cultural landscape and really our culture and livelihood. Um, so I'd like to take an opportunity to kind of introduce some of those aspects. So again, I pulled up the PowerPoint to kind of pinpoint some of the more key or important values you'll find throughout the text. So really introducing this idea is that when we talk about agriculture, it's not just plants, it's everything between plants, meats, and also the plants that we grow not just to consume but then to process to turn into whether it be ethanol for cars or maybe it is into sugar or things along those lines. And so anything that can be then grown, transported, and then delivered to a consumer really kind of falls within this. As an example, in California, we know that one of our large exports is going to be nuts, wine, and we also do a lot of livestock, rice, and it's a little bit of everything that can be grown. Even floriculture is a huge market for California, specifically Southern California, where they get a little bit warmer. But that being said, what's interesting about looking at the landscape of food is that in the United States, between 35 and 40% of all agriculture grown is actually thrown away before even a vendor can pick it up because it does not meet market standards. So as an example, the oranges can be too large, too small, the wrong color, the wrong shape. They're kind of like the oops of produce, and so about 40% is thrown away, which is really, really tragic because if you think about just obesity in the United States, you think about hunger. Uh, if we actually consumed all the produce that we grew, we would have an excess still after providing everyone with fresh produce. So those are some real big challenges that we're dealing with at the present time because not only are we wasting the produce, we're wasting the water. Another thing that the book really kind of goes through is talking about distance traveled. Because if you think about it, the shorter the distance that the produce has to travel, the cheaper it will be and the fresher it will be. Well, in that case, most of our cities have been overrun with structures, and so we can't really grow anything there anymore. So we have to import and export produce, which then makes the produce not as fresh. It will also then add on to the cost of the produce. So if you can buy something at your local farm, you might be only spending $1 on it. But if you go to a grocery store which was imported from several cities or states away, it might be $3 or $4 more. So those are some things to really think about. The book also talks a lot about corn and how we use corn not just to eat as corn, but as we can process it into ethanol. But also the big one is high fructose corn syrup, that we use it as an artificial sugar because sugar cane is really, really expensive to use. So that's why we kind of introduced this idea of alternative sweeteners. So Monsanto was hired initially to do that. They made aspartame, which is what's used in most of our sodas, and artificial sweeteners in food and things along those lines. And the book goes through a lot with talking about what is more culturally identified as the Mexican Coke, which is Coca-Cola that was made actually in Mexico. And because they do not use artificial sweeteners, they actually still use raw sugar cane, which then not just increases the price of the beverage, but it also increases the flavor. And really, if you think about it, the safety of it, because you're using more genuine uh, elements versus using processed chemicals. Then moving forward, the author is actually he's Dr. Graves is from Ohio, and he has a huge passion for barbecue, and so he talks a lot about the different types of barbecue that are out there. Maybe you've been to the grocery store and seen all the barbecue sauces and seen that there's types for the South, the North, the Carolinas, Texas, all these different types of ways that we barbecue. And he talks a little bit about that because it's something that a lot of us are familiar with, but he brings it in the different perspective of, well, why are they different? It's not just the spices, but it's also the way that the meat has been prepared. It's also what those animals were fed. It's also the type of wood that is used to burn to barbecue. We're using a mesquite, or we're using an oak or a pine, and so we have all these different labels that are on meats that are bought, but the author likes to go into the depth of, well, why is that important? Because if we think about it, if you go to certain places like maybe in Kansas City, their type of barbecue is very different because not just the spices, but also the climate and what trees and vegetation are able to grow. And so all those things influence the overall flavor and taste, which is kind of interesting. And he uses barbecue as an example, but really it's limitless. If you think about almost anything, think about rice, or, we'll use rice as it's a good example. If you look at different cultures that consume rice, There's different recipes that are had. Some people produce rice where it's just raw white rice. Some people like to put in peas and corn and celery and things like that. Tomato, maybe chicken base. So there's all these different recipes to create really the same thing, but it's because of those cultural influences that really have to do with the region in which it originated from, what was local to you. We're spoiled. We can go to the store and buy whatever we want, whenever we want. Um, if you grew up perhaps in pre-90s, 1990s, you will then have to remember that there was a time that you could not buy a tomato. There were times that you could not buy peaches or avocados because you could only buy produce that was in the actual growing period, what was available. And we live in a society where when we run out of the growing period of tomatoes, when we get closer towards the fall, we then import tomatoes from other countries so that we can continue to provide tomatoes all year round. But in olden days, you didn't. You only were able to purchase the produce that was available. And what type of footprint does that leave on the landscape? Well, obviously there's an economic footprint, looking at where this is being exported, imported, and the costs that go from there. But we're also going to be looking at just the fact that we're overproducing produce around the world. As an example, here in California, we produce a ton of almonds, but almonds take about 10 gallons per nut of water to grow. But we rarely consume California almonds. We actually export them because we make more money by selling them to other foreign countries and buying their poorer quality almonds and then importing them in here and consuming those for candies and stuff like that. So when you start thinking about these models and how this trade has been done, it's actually quite interesting. Um, Moving forward, the text also talks about the von Thunen's model, which really looks at how our landscape was set up, how we designed it, how you had a central infrastructure, and then as you move farther out, you had your agriculture and the things along those lines. And think about where you lived. Is there a model that you can portray? We'll talk more about different landscape models further in the semester when we look at urban geography, but we start to identify that there are these models, that there is this design that really, really does work. And much of it was probably done with just a discourse, meaning that they did it because it made sense, but now we can look at it and replicate it as a system. Moving forward into relationships and population, think about the produce that is needed to survive. Um, Another thing that was kind of interesting that he brings in, which is something that I'm also very passionate about, which is kind of that vintage neon signs. We call it Googie, which is really the 1950s, 60s era. We'll talk more about that later. But what's interesting is that a lot of the signs represent food. And how do we look? As an example, he uses Dairy Queen, and there's a very distinct design to that sign that lets us know what it is. Okay, it's a Dairy Queen. What is it known for? It's known for their shakes and malts and things along that line. And then looking at the cultural landscape, especially in California along the five, heading up north from down south to Northern California, there used to be Orange Julius's and Dairy Queens throughout the Central Valley, specifically because of the fact that they had fresh milk. You had these dairy farms that were all along the 5 freeway that they could produce fresh milk and do fresh ice cream and stuff like that. And it's just really interesting when you think about kind of going back into the landscape, when if you were to then transport things very closely, what could you produce? Think about even produce stands. Sometimes you'll go by a farm that maybe they're harvesting avocados, and then right outside the farm, the family will also be selling some additional produce to the public. And so those are really fresh attributes to our landscape. Other examples that the text goes through, we'll be talking about rice, things along that line, which is interesting. We grow a lot of rice in California, yet we have very little water, and a tremendous amount of water is needed for rice. But it's because we consume it. We expect to have it. We have this mentality of large portions, and to be able to have these incredible flavors from around the world. We're very, very fortunate for our climate, where we have a Mediterranean climate, which means we can pretty much grow everything all year round in California, somewhere within it. And so it's really, really interesting to discuss that. You will continue working through looking more at boundaries design. And then he asks the last part again, we have to bring in agriculture and architecture and looking at some of the different farm buildings that are within our landscape. And chances are, if you've traveled outside of your city, you may have seen a lot of them. So the big walk away is just discussing within yourself as well. We require agriculture. We need it, whether you're vegetarian or herbivore or anything in between. There is a cultural imprint, and there's also a carbon footprint left on the landscape. Whether you're consuming produce as a primary form of protein, whether you're consuming meats, whether you're consuming, again, anything in between. And then you have to think about also then the transport. So if you're, I don't know, we'll use avocados as a example, and that seems to be California. If you go anywhere around the world, it's the California whatever because it has avocado on it. Where did the avocado come from? It used to be about 70% of all avocados came out of Ventura County until we reached an agreement with Mexico to allow the import of the Mexican avocado. And maybe you've listened to the radio or seen commercials where they compete back and forth, two different versions of the Hass avocado. But nonetheless, where are they coming from? How much water is needed? What about the nutrients for the soil? And is it being overgrown? And then actually you can get into more of the political aspect. There's a short period of time in which the cartels owned the rights to the Mexican avocado, and then there was a big payoff there, which was really quite unfortunate for the families that were then, these family farms that were growing things in these smaller villages in Mexico. Then they had to pay off the cartels in order to get their produce transported to California. And so there's really a lot more of this worldwide cultural imprint that is really interesting to see. Another fun fact before I let you go, if perhaps you've ever been to Disneyland, they do often candies there on Main Street, and they only buy local produce. So if it's not available, they will actually import their produce from Florida, from small farms, and unless they can produce it on their own ranch, which is the Golden Oak Ranch here in Santa Clarita. So I hope you enjoy this chapter, and we'll talk soon.